Good evening, friends. Rishikesh Vyas and Udan Saluters welcomes you all for today's webinar. Today's title is Operation and Mismanagement Tilting the Scales in Favor of Minority Shareholders. We are very fortunate that today we have amongst us our one of very own and integral part of the Udan Saluters, Advocate Akash Menon, based out of Mumbai. Before commencing the today's seminar, let me take this opportunity in introducing you all to Akash Menon. Akash Menon also happens to be the founding member partner of Mankawa and Banerjee Advocates. He is based out of Mumbai with a focused practice in corporate commercial litigations, arbitration, and dispute resolution. Akash has also conducted matters in the Bombay High Court, the District Courts, the National Company Law Tribunal, National Company Appellate Tribunal, Debts Recovery Tribunal, the Securities Appellate Tribunal, and before judicial magistrate, estate officers, official liquidators, and court receivers. He has also advised various clients on issues concerning debt recovery, regulatory compliances, arbitration, banking law, tort, criminal action, corporate governance, intellectual property, constitutional law, and I can go on and on. Prior to starting independent practice, Mr. Akash Menon was an understudy with counsel Mr. Suresh Gupte. He thereafter worked with reputed law firms like Shardul Amurchand Mangaldas and Khaitan and Company. Akash has studied in the Symbiosis Law College, Pune, completing his bachelor's in business administration along with his bachelor's in law. Mr. Menon, we welcome you, and now it is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vyas. It's, as always, a pleasure to be here. This is indeed an interesting topic, and I'm privileged for getting this opportunity to be sharing and discussing this aspect of the law with all of you. As all of you may be aware, there is a certain amount of democracy that is found in corporate governance. What we're essentially speaking of are inherent mechanisms in the Companies Act to ensure that there is a spirit of democracy, that everybody's voice is heard, and there are necessary checks and balances provided in that. We've all heard of boardroom dramas, be it DAT and ITC, very recently Indigo. Yes Bank in the past has had a lot of boardroom dramas. All of this essentially arises out of the same corporate governance that we speak of, because there are checks and balances available for countering forces within the company itself to battle it out and, in the spirit of democracy, ensure that the majority view holds, that the rights of the many outweigh the rights of the few. But what happens in situations where the rights of the few need protection? What happens when the law is required to step in to ensure that the views of the minority are not in any way overlooked or trampled upon by the majority? It is in this circumstance that we see the evolution of law as far as oppression and mismanagement is concerned. Just to give you a brief background as to oppression and mismanagement, this law found its bearings right with the English law. The English law on this, in fact, started with believing that minority shareholders in fact don't have any rights. The only way a minority shareholder could exercise rights in the nature of oppression and mismanagement would be in circumstances where the minority shareholder would go to court and establish that the trampling of his rights are so grave that the company itself ought to be bound up. And therefore, what was expected was minority shareholders filing winding up petitions, making out a case that there is a just and equitable cause on the basis of which the company ought to be bound up because the company is oppressing its minority shareholders, it's conducting its affairs in a manner that is prejudicial to its own interests, and therefore ought not to be allowed to continue. From this extreme position, we have seen a gradual transition towards understanding that you probably don't need to close down a company if it is not managing its affairs. what's essentially required is for the NCLT to wrap the knuckles of the board or the majority to ensure that they're brought into line, and the company, in the spirit of perpetuity, which is what company law itself is based on, that spirit of perpetuity is allowed to continue. It is in this background that we have to understand what the law of oppression and mismanagement is. I very strongly believe that if you need to know what you are today, you need to understand where you came from. It is for this reason that let's go back and understand the 170-year-old journey that company law in India has traversed. Company legislation in India started with the Joint Stock Companies Act, 1850, 170 years back. The Indian company law has been largely based on the prevailing English law. The predecessor of the Indian Companies Act of 1956 is the Companies Act of 1913, which underwent several amendments, most crucial of which are the 1936 and the 1951 amendments. The period of the Second World War turned out to be a crucial turning point for company law, not just within India, but across common law jurisdictions. What we found was that governments realized, legislatures realized the need to update the company law in light of the post-World War situation, which is really where a large part of the modern day corporate law is found. In 1948, the English, on the basis of recommendations made by the Cohen Committee, decided to refurbish their Companies Act. Since we were under English rule, those changes were in a matter brought to Indian shores. And we then found ourselves with a very crucial amendment that was discussed since the early 1940s and eventually found place by way of an ordinance in 1951 and then was converted into the Amendment Act of 1951. What is very crucial, as a small bit of trivia that not many people would know, is that there were two individuals, Sri Trikumdas Dwarkadas and Sri V. K. Tiruvenkatachari from Bombay and Madras respectively, who were very instrumental in revisiting the old 1913 law and understanding what needed to be done in the new age era. And let's bear in mind that by the time the amendment came into force, and of course we transitioned into the 1956 enactment, we were already an independent sovereign. It is in this backdrop that we must understand the changes that were brought about by the subsequent Bhabha Committee, because the Bhabha Committee really worked on the recommendations made by Sri Dwarkadas and Sri Tiruvenkatachari and built on that and proposed what brought about a sea change in Indian corporate law by enacting the Indian Companies Act of 1956. The Indian Companies Act, the Companies Bill, was introduced in the Parliament on 2nd of September 1953 and eventually passed in November 1955, coming to force eventually on the 1st of April 1956. Before we embark into understanding in greater detail oppression and mismanagement, what you should bear in mind are there are two essential facets of how we understand companies today, of how the law understands companies today, and how businesses understand companies as a legal entity. The Corporate Governance Committee report of the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, published on the 5th of October 2017, believes that there are two broad styles of running a company. The Raja or the monarch model, which essentially puts the promoter at the helm, and the promoter, the decision of the promoter influences the decision of the majority and in turn the decision of the company. The second model is of course the custodian or the trusteeship model, where interests of all stakeholders are considered in the absence of a singular promoter, in the absence of a singular majority shareholder who tends to command a certain sway within the boardroom, within the annual general meetings. Indian companies traditionally are more likely to follow the monarch model as against the trusteeship model. This is something that I think all of us would know. If I'm not mistaken, I think L&T is one of the few companies which has abandoned the promoter model and adopted to a larger extent the trusteeship model. Reliance is one of the very, very crucial examples of a monarch model. And it has traditionally been done exceptionally well. I guess there are pros and cons for both models. Neither is wrong, both are right. It's a question of how each individual business is run at the end of the day. Now, to understand oppression and mismanagement as we enter into that sphere, under the UK Companies Act of 1929, the only remedy against oppression actions of the majority shareholders, as I have said before, was to prefer a petition for winding up of the company on just and equitable grounds. This was the broad umbrella, the overarching residual clause, the basis of which you could prefer an action against majority excesses. In Foss versus Harbottle, it was propounded that if the alleged wrong can be confirmed or ratified by a simple majority of members in a general meeting, then the court would not interfere. So the law at that time was so intense that it felt that even if an action was brought by the minority shareholders for winding up the company on just and equitable grounds, and the company subsequently stands up and says, you know what, I have the majority, I can prove it to you right now, that becomes a case of a carried question, which essentially means that the argument falls because the minority has not been able to prove the numbers when the matter is put to vote. A need was therefore felt to redress such situations by providing the courts with discretion. And I want you to bear this in mind, that this is going to be a crucial element of oppression and mismanagement cases as we understand it in its entirety. That it is always at the discretion of the court to understand the facts and circumstances at hand and decide for itself whether there is in fact a cause made out for interfering with the corporate governance model, the democracy that is otherwise available, and step into the shoes and make decisions on behalf of the board, on behalf of the general body. Section 210 of the UK Companies Act is what we find today in many parts in the 1956 Act and the 2013 Act. Under Section 210, the court, if satisfied that a winding up order would not be justice to the minority shareholders, would be empowered to make such other order as it deemed fit on finding that the acts or omissions of the majority shareholders were oppressive and justified winding up the company on fair and equitable grounds. Now, when I said that we need to understand the history to understand what the present is, it is essentially because of this. Then let's bear in mind that the entire gamut of oppression and mismanagement laws drew from the law relating to winding up, and that it is the only other remedy available for a minority shareholder was to take the company into winding up. It is from this point that we find the deviation. We find ourselves stretching from that situation into a situation where the law eventually realized that there is really no need to wind up the company. But you will find vestiges of this even today in the 56 Act and the 2013 Act, when the law stipulates that the circumstances, the series of events that have led to the filing of the filing of the Oppression and Mismanagement Act should be such that they should shock the conscience of the court and convince the court that winding up really is the only remedy available to remedy such a wrong. The company, in the given circumstances, cannot be allowed to continue. That's really the basis on which the entire law of operation and mismanagement has been founded. And you, as a litigator, as a litigant, walking into court seeking remedy, seeking relief under the operation and mismanagement laws, must ensure that your case is that foolproof, that emphatic, to ensure that the courts are made to believe that the only way this right can be remedied is by winding up of the company. The aforementioned provisions of Section 210 of the UK Act came to be incorporated as Sections 153C and 153D of the Indian Companies Act of 1913 by way of the 1951 amendment that we spoke of. These provisions, in a sense, were replicated as Sections 397 and 398 of the Companies Act 1956, which borrowed extensively in terms of these specific provisions from the 1951 amendment. I believe, and I believe this is still the case, that mismanagement as a concept, mismanagement as an idea, never found root in the UK jurisprudence. This was something that we indigenously were able to establish and create within the Indian laws. It has been included to appropriately address issues that are peculiar to the Indian context or scheme of things. That is why reference to mismanagement is something that you will find very peculiarly in the Indian law. I believe the 1953 report observed in this regard that we have carefully examined the scope of the section and consider that not only can it be suitably be adapted to the circumstances of this country, but its scope may be appropriately enlarged to cover not only cases of oppression to minority shareholders, but also of gross mismanagement of the affairs of a company, which cannot be otherwise suitably dealt with under the other provisions of this Act. It is in the 1956 Act that we see a marked deviation from the earlier regime of disassociating the provisions of oppression and mismanagement from winding up, while retaining, as I said, some elements of the earlier regime. The nature and meaning of mismanagement with respect to Section 153C of the 1913 Act and Section 398 of the 1956 Act, dealing with the power of the court to prevent mismanagement, will be revealed from the judicial trend in the Indian cases, for it is purely an Indian phenomenon. As has already been discussed under the statutory provisions, the first ever Indian statute remedy in Section 153 of the 1913 Act for mismanagement was composited with that of oppression. 398 of the 1956 Act was enacted on the recommendations of the Bhabha Committee and dealing this remedy from mismanagement, from winding up. Now, when I speak of this, what we really need to understand is that traditionally, when we were looking at the English Act and we were looking at the subsequent adaptations in the Indian law, we were essentially speaking of a situation where oppression and mismanagement is considered as a bundle, as a single basket. In the absence of specific statutory differentiations or statutory distinctions, most cases that came to be filed in India post 1951 were cases where oppression and mismanagement were argued together. Oppression and mismanagement was petitioned in the same petition by the same set of petitioners because they believed one really not be divorced from the other. It is in this background that we must consider the evolution of law and how an effort has been made to try and distinguish the two. A very simplistic differentiation as far as oppression and mismanagement is concerned is to understand that oppression essentially is a claim made by a member or a segment of members who come together and make the claim of oppression as minority shareholders against the will of the majority within the company. Mismanagement, on the other hand, is understood to be an action in rem. It is an action where members, most likely in the minority, would come together and inform the court that the conduct of the company is being carried out in such a manner that it is likely to be prejudicial to the interests of the company at large and not just the rights of a few. This is the essential broad-based differentiation between the two, which we must always bear in mind. There are distinctions to this provided in the statutes itself, and as and when we read the individual sections, we will realize how these distinguishments have been carved out and how the courts have slowly evolved to differentiate oppression claims from claims of mismanagement. Let us now delve a little further and understand the statutes. I will take a moment to read the language of the crucial sections because I believe it is very essential that we understand how the language evolved, how the language remained, and the scope and measure that is provided in the 1956 Act and the 2013 Act. If you would allow a moment, I'll just try to present the screen. Let's first consider section 397, application to tribunal. You will find that the word tribunal is mentioned in square brackets. This in turn refers to an amendment of the 2002 Act by which the word tribunal was placed instead of the Company Law Board. It is a reflection of the general system which we are able to enforce our legislations and enforce the necessary infrastructure that is required. Because in 2002, we considered for the first time the establishment of a National Company Law Tribunal. And 14 years later is when the National Company Law Tribunal was in fact brought into force in 2016. Ram came back from Vanvas before that. That's the kind of time we take. All right, section 397, the application of tribunals for relief in cases of oppression. Any members of a company who complain that the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, number one, public interest, or in a manner oppressive to any member or members, including any or more of themselves, that's number two, may apply to the tribunal for an order under this section, provided such members have a right so to apply in virtue of section 399. If on any application under subsection 1, the tribunal is of the opinion, A, that the company's affairs are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, or in a manner oppressive to any member or members, and B, that to wind up the company would unfairly prejudice such members, a member or members, that otherwise the facts would justify the making of a winding up order. Residues again of the old English regime. Justify the making of a winding up order on the ground that it was just and equitable that the company should be wound up. In such circumstances, the tribunal may, with a view to bringing to an end the matters complained of, make such orders as it thinks fit. 398. Application to tribunal for relief in cases of mismanagement. Any members of a company who complain that the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. So these are the three ingredients that we must identify from 397 and 398. We're speaking of public interests, interests of a member or members, and three, the interests of the company. These are the three essential elements that you will need to prove in any action for oppression or mismanagement. that the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. B, that a material change not being a change brought about by or in the interest of any creditors, including debenture holders or any class of shareholders of the company, has taken place in the management or control of the company, whether by an alteration in its board of directors or manager, or in the ownership of the company's shares, or if it has no share capital in its membership or in any other manner whatsoever, and that by reason of such change, it is likely that the affairs of the company will be conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. This is the fourth element that we find in the 1956 Act, which essentially considers a situation where, by the will of the majority, if there is a substantial change in the management of the company, and such management is likely to be prejudicial to the interests of prejudicial to public interest, the interests of the company, or to the interests of the members, you could then make out a case under this subsection. Subsection 2. If on any application under subsection 1, the tribunal is of the opinion that the affairs of the company are being conducted as aforesaid, or that by reason of any material change as aforesaid in the management or control of the company, it is likely that the affairs of the company will be conducted as aforesaid. The tribunal may, with a view to bringing an end or preventing the matters complained of or apprehended, make such order as it thinks fit. Let's bear in mind, this is the discretion that is now being made available to the tribunal. There is, in most other statutes, we understand how statutes are read and interpreted. In many cases, there is a mandate where the legislature mandates that you must recognize this right, you must protect this right. In this particular case, in 397 and 398, what we find is a situation where the legislature recognizes the need for everything to be considered on a case-to-case basis. And on that basis alone, decides that there should be necessary discretion vested with the National Company Law Tribunal. All right, now we come to a very crucial section, which is 399, because this decides the eligibility of members in making claims under 397, 398. The following members of a company shall have the right to apply under section 397 or 398. Now, there's a lot of legalese in this section. I will therefore make it slightly simpler for you to understand. This is something we find not just in the section 399 of the 1956 Act, but it is found in section 153C of the 1913 Act, and 100 years later in section 244 of the 2013 Act. All of them provide that if you want to mount a claim under oppression and mismanagement, you would have to be you would have to fall within one of the three categories. One, that if there is a company with a share capital not less than 100 members or 1/10 of the total number of members, whichever is lesser may apply. So depending on the nature of the company, you must meet a certain threshold. Thus, so for example, if you're a company of less than 1,000 members, you had to apply the test of 100 members. Whereas if you had, you had to apply the test of 1/10 of the total number of members. And if you had more than 1,000 members, you simply apply the 100-member rule. It all comes down to the numbers at the end of the day, whichever is lesser. A welcome modification that we find in the 2013 Act as compared to the 1956 Act is in the proviso to the section, which states as follows: provided that the tribunal may, on an application made to it in this behalf, waive all or any of the requirements specified in Clause A or Clause B, so as to enable the members to apply under Section 241. This is the first time the legislature realized that in certain circumstances, it may not be possible for that many number of members to come together in a conjoint action. And they therefore recognize the right of the power of the National Company Law Tribunal to, in befitting cases, waive the requirement under 244, waive the requirement of meeting 100 members or 1/10 the total number of members or 1/5 if there is if it's a company without a share capital. This is very crucial because it ensures that irrespective of your shareholding, irrespective of how small you may be in the scheme of the company, you will still be given a voice. There was a similar provision under the 1956 Act as well. Unfortunately, what happened is that under the 1956 Act, the exception was only to the extent of the central government being able to identify certain circumstances in which such a waiver should be allowed and specifically waive the eligibility criteria in those specific circumstances as against a blanket waiver. I, for one, cannot think of even a single situation in which the central government made such an exception under the 1956 regime. Having considered these sections, let us, I'll take you very briefly to section 401, I'm sorry, which is the right of the central government to apply under section 397 and 398. That is, the central government may itself apply to the tribunal for an order under 397 or 398, or cause an application to be made to the tribunal for such an order by any person authorized by it in this behalf. This is a broad-based power that was available with the central government, in a sense, exercised by the Registrar of Companies. Now let us look at the provisions under the 2013 Act. Section 241 in Chapter 16 of the 2013 Act refers to application of tribunal for relief in cases of oppression, etc. Any member of a company who complains that the affairs of the company have been or are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, or in a manner prejudicial or oppressive to him or any other member or members, or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. You will see, as against 397, 398 regime, what we find here is that 397 and 398 have been boxed together under the same subclause. So it speaks of all of the three ingredients in the same breath. The affairs of the company have been conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, that's one. Prejudicial or oppressive to the member or the members, or three, in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. As again, a small trivia, what you may notice if you read the 1913 Act is that there was a requirement for any member who is seeking to make an action, make a claim under oppression for oppression and mismanagement. He had to himself be a party to the proceedings. My reading of this section suggests that that requirement has now been done away with, and you may make an application on behalf of other members. The material change not being subclause B, we're reading, the material change not being a change brought about by or in the interests of any creditors, including debenture holders or any class of shareholders of the company, is taking place in the management or control of the company, whether by an alteration in the board of directors or manager, or in the ownership of the company's shares, or if it has no share capital, in its membership, or in any other manner whatsoever, and that by reason of such change, it is likely that the affairs of the company will be conducted in a manner prejudicial to its interests or its members or any class of members. And in such circumstances, you may apply to the tribunal, provided such member has a right to apply under section 244. We will not read 244 because I have already pointed out what the eligibility criteria are. Let us for a moment delve into what the powers of the tribunal are, because this is important in understanding how far the NCLT can go in regulating the conduct of an errant company, in regulating the conduct of an errant board. Powers of Tribunal 242. If on any application made under Section 241, the Tribunal is of the opinion, A, that the company's affairs have been or are being conducted in a manner prejudicial or oppressive to any member or members, or prejudicial to public interest, or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company, and B, that to wind up the company would unfairly prejudice such members, but that otherwise the facts would justify the making of a winding up order on the ground that it was just and equitable that the company should be wound up. As again, we find elements of the old English regime, where the threshold that you need to meet as a claimant under 241 is that you must be able to show, you must be able to shock the conscience of the court to such an extent that winding up of the company appears to be the only other remedy, and that is the only way that you can stem the rot that is running within the defaulting company. Without prejudice, I'm reading subsection 2, without prejudice to the generality of the powers under subsection 1, an order under that subsection may provide for A. Now this is the entire range of powers that are available to the National Company Law Tribunal, and the varied extent to which it can go about running the company or regulating the company. A, the regulation of conduct of affairs of the company in future. B, the purchase of shares or interests of any members of the company by other members thereof or by the company. C, in the case of a purchase of its shares by the company as aforesaid, the consequent reduction of its share capital. D, restrictions on the transfer or allotment of the shares of the company. E, the termination, setting aside or modification of any agreement also arrived at between the company and the managing director, any other director or manager, on such terms and conditions as may, in the opinion of the tribunal, be just and equitable in the circumstances of the case. F, the termination, setting aside or modification of any agreement between the company and any person other than those referred to in clause E. Now, these subclauses are very crucial, because what this essentially says is that if the company were to enter into a third-party transaction, enter into an agreement with the third party, then NCLT could bring within its purview even those contracts. This is essentially to safeguard against possible related party transactions that promoters may enter into, that persons in control may enter into, to benefit their individual personal interests and further these ulterior motives. One proviso to subclause F is that provided that no such agreement shall be terminated, set aside, or modified except after due notice and after obtaining the consent of the party concerned. G, the setting aside of any transfer, delivery of goods, payment, execution, or other act relating to property made or done by or against the company within 3 months before the date of the application under this section, which would, if made or done by or against an individual, be deemed in his insolvency to be a fraudulent preference. H, removal of the managing director, manager, or any of the directors of the company. This is an oft referred to power. This is the power that in many cases you would find reference to, where you try to remove members of the board. This is, of course, this could also be part of a larger boardroom strategy, where you try to elbow out certain non-conforming directors, and in turn bring in directors of your choosing. Recovery of, I'm reading I, subclause I, recovery of undue gains made by any managing director, manager, or director during the period of his appointment as such, and the manner of utilization of the recovery, including transfer to investor education and protection funds or repayment to identifiable victims. J, the manner in which the managing director or manager of the company may be appointed subsequent to an order removing the existing managing director or manager of the company made under clause H. K, appointment of such number of persons as directors who may be required by the tribunal to report to the tribunal on such matters as the tribunal may direct. L, imposition of costs as may be deemed fit by the tribunal. And M, any other matter for which, in the opinion of the tribunal, it is just and equitable that provision should be made. And I thank you for bearing with me while I read this, but it was crucial for you to understand. And for want of being better, I really would not have been able to put this in better language than is already found in the statute. This is really the larger scope of the National Company Law Tribunal, and to what extent it may pass orders, pass directions, pass strictures against an errant company, against an errant board of directors. I will take you to one last section, which I think is very crucial to understanding this particular subject. And that is section 245. This was hitherto not found before under the earlier regimes in this particular fashion. And it has offered, in many senses, a diluted threshold for approaching the National Company Law Tribunal. What it essentially does is to say that, all right, if you're not able to meet the criteria, where essentially you have to make out a case that the misconduct is of such a grave nature that winding up really ought to be ordered, but ought not to be ordered, and therefore let's invoke section 241 for directions of oppression and mismanagement, for correcting actions of oppression and mismanagement. What section 245 does is offer you a diluted version of the same claims of oppression and mismanagement really. And it says that in certain circumstances, in the stipulated circumstances, you as a member of the company could make an application before the National Company Law Tribunal and seek necessary redress. Let's read 245, class action. Such number of member or members, depositor or depositors. Now, this is again a crucial variation. It's not found, we're not talking just of members, but also depositors, or any class of them as the case may be, as are indicated in subsection 2, may, if they are of the opinion that the management or conduct of the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company or its members or depositors, similar as under 241, file an application before the tribunal on behalf of the member or depositors for seeking all or any of the following orders. Namely, this is again where we enter into the area of the powers available to the National Company Law Tribunal. These are the reliefs that you may, as an aggrieved member, seek. A, to restrain the company from committing an act which is ultra vires the articles or memorandum of the company. B, to restrain the company from committing breach of any provisions of the company's memorandum or articles. C, to declare a resolution altering the memorandum or articles of the company as void if the resolution was passed by suppression of material facts or obtained by misstatement to the members or depositors. D, to restrain the company and its directors from acting on such resolution. E, to restrain the company from doing an act which is contrary to the provisions of this act or any other law for the time being in force. F, to restrain the company from taking action contrary to any resolution passed by the members. G, to claim damages or compensation or demand any other suitable action from or against 1, the company or its directors for any fraudulent, unlawful or wrongful act or omission or conduct or any likely act or omission or conduct on its or their part. 2, the auditor, including the audit firm. Now, this is crucial again. This is something that was not found before. This is something that's not available if you were to make an action for operational mismanagement under 241 of the earlier 397, 398. You could also bring into the purview of this wrongful action the actions of third-party auditor firms, or auditors appointed by the company for auditing its books. The auditor, including audit firm of the company, for any improper or misleading statement of particulars made in his audit report, or for any fraudulent, unlawful, or wrongful act or conduct. Or 3, any expert or revisor or consultant or any other person for any incorrect or misleading statement made to the company, or for any fraudulent, unlawful, or wrongful act or conduct, or any likely act or conduct on his part. And lastly, to seek any remedy as the tribunal deem fit. Again, indication of the intent of the legislature to give large powers to the National Company Law Tribunal to do as may deem fit in the circumstances and the facts of a given case. Allow me a moment. This really brings us to the end of what we are understanding as the provisions of the statute as far as oppression and mismanagement are concerned. Let us now go further and understand how courts have, since the early 1900s, explored the ocean of law, which is oppression and mismanagement. And I say this specifically because it is crucial for us to understand that at the end of the day, what we are looking at is a situation where, in the given circumstances, the law statute provides very little in terms of guidance, and it is for the judicial fora, the National Company Law Tribunal in this case, earlier the Company Law Board, to decide for itself if a certain case merits the interference of the court and what are the ingredients on the basis of which we must reach this conclusion. To broadly summarize, in order to successfully bring a claim under 241 of the 2013 Act, the minority shareholders have to demonstrate that, one, the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the members, with a lack of probity. Now, this is an interesting word that you find that finds mention in various judgments. Probity is essentially a threshold that the courts have held, essentially meaning, are you as a company, are you as the board of directors acting in a morally sound manner? Are any of your acts, maybe not illegal, but immoral? Are you in your actions staying within the four corners of the law, but at the same time exceeding your moral obligations to your minority shareholders, to those shareholders who do not have a voice in the majority, do not have a voice in the boardroom? With lack of probity and in a burdensome, harsh, and wrongful manner. Now, this is language we'll, of course, explore that case in greater detail, but it is in the seminal judgment of Needle Industries that then Chief Justice of India, Y.V. Chandrachud, spoke of these three elements, being guiding lights and understanding where action is oppressive or the conduct of a company are being mismanaged. It would be just, the second ground is that it would be just and equivalent for the company to be wound up, but such an order would prejudice the interests of the company. It is not possible to exhaustively set out the various situations justifying winding up of the company on just and equitable grounds. But ordinarily, the loss of a substratum of the company's business, a boardroom deadlock, or complete loss of confidence are regarded as situations giving rise to winding up on just and equitable grounds. Further, it would have to be demonstrated that the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner prejudicial to public interest, to the interest of the company itself, or that there's a material change in the management of the company. Let us now consider, as I said, the cases. Now, in the pre-1956 era, the threshold to be met for establishing acts of oppression and mismanagement were to fall within the broader ambit of just and equitable, as I said. And that's a really broad spectrum to be trying to fit the law into. just and equitable grounds for winding up a company are fairly wide and they cannot be reduced to a sum of particular instances. However, over a period of time, the courts in common law jurisdictions have formulated broad tests to determine whether acts or omissions give rise to just and equitable grounds for winding up the company. In one of the earlier cases of Baird versus Bees, 1924 SC 83 at page 92, Lord Clyde attempted to set out some of the considerations that could be taken into account by courts while determining whether there were just and equitable grounds for winding up the company. He formulated the three tests: the objects test, that is, defined objects in the constitutional documents of the company; the management and control test, which is the business is to be carried on by certain persons elected by the shareholders in a prescribed way, for example, the board of directors, to carry on business in accordance with the articles of association of the company. The third test was the statutory compliance test, where the business is being conducted in accordance with certain principles of commercial administration defined in the statute, which provide guarantee of commercial probity and efficiency. If any of these conditions are deliberately and consistently violated and disregarded by actions of members who possess overwhelming voting power in the exercise of their rights, it would be just and equitable to wind up the company. Now, these were the early guidelines. Let's bear in mind that these were the early guidelines into understanding what would fall within the definition of just and equitable, what would fall within the spectrum of just and equitable, and therefore, what is the threshold that needed to be met by a minority shareholder who is making a claim akin to oppression and mismanagement. Now, Indian courts have similarly over time adopted tests to determine whether certain acts amount to oppression under the Indian law, oppression or mismanagement. The seminal judgment I was talking about, Needle Industries India Limited versus Needle Industries Newey Holding Limited and others, 1981, 3 SCC 333. I think any student of corporate law must read this exhaustive precedent, this exhaustive case, because it has considered in great detail what we today understand as fundamental principles of corporate, of the jurisprudence of corporate law. It was held in this case, Justice Y.V. Chandrachud presiding. The minority shareholders complaining of oppression under Section 397 have to demonstrate that they were constrained to submit to continuous acts or omissions, which were 1, unfair, 2, lacked in probity, and 3, prejudiced the exercise of their legal and proprietary rights as shareholders of the company. This section confers a wider power on the court to deal with such a situation in an equitable manner. Equity, that is the spirit of fairness, the idea of fairness, and this was held fundamental to what the courts must bear in mind when they deal with cases. That you must act, you must do what you would otherwise do in equity, even though the legislation may not provide the necessary guiding lines. We then come to another important case of Shanti Prasad Jain versus Kalinga Tubes Limited. This, of course, came before Needle Industries, but explored in some detail what sections 397 and 398 provided. Now, this case involved a battle between two groups of shareholders of a private company. In July 1954, these two groups, who held an equal number of shares of the value of around 21 lakh, or of a total share capital of around 25 lakh, entered into an agreement with the appellant, who was a third party, and certain terms were agreed to. Various resolutions were passed by the company to implement the agreement. However, neither the articles of association were changed to embody the terms of the agreement, nor the resolutions passed referring to this agreement. In 56-57, the company desired to raise a loan from the Industrial Finance Corporation. And as per the requirements of the corporation, in January 57, the company was converted into a public company, and appropriate amendments of the purpose were made in the Articles of Association. The Memorandum of Association and Articles of Association being the constitutional documents of the company, and the governing principles on the base, and containing the governing principles, the governing extent to which, or the manner in which the company is to be run. Now, disputes having arisen, the matter reached court. The appellant claimed the benefit of the agreement of July 1954, the appellant being third party. It was held by this court that the said agreement was not binding even on the private company and much less so on the public company when it came into existence in 1957. It was an agreement between a non-member and two members of the company, and although for some time the agreement was carried out, some of its terms could not be put in the Articles of Association of the public company, and therefore the company was not bound by the agreement, and it was held, the agreement was held to be not enforceable. I'm quoting from the case. For a petition under section 397 to succeed, it is not enough to show that there is just an equitable cause for winding up the company, though that must be shown as preliminary to the application of section 397. It must further be shown that the conduct of the majority shareholders was oppressive to the minority as members, and this requires that events have to be considered not in isolation, but as a part of a consecutive story. There must be continuous acts on the part of the majority shareholders, continuing up to the date of the manner oppressive to some part of the members. This conduct must be burdensome, harsh, and wrongful, and mere lack of confidence between the majority shareholders and the minority shareholders would not be enough unless lack of confidence springs from oppression of the minority by a majority in the management of the company's affairs. And such oppression must involve at least an element of lack of probity or fair dealing to a member in the matter of his proprietary rights as a shareholder. This is a very important point of law that we must bear in mind, that if you are seeking remedy on the basis of a third-party contract, you must bear that the contract must be reflected in the constitutional documents of the company, in the absence of which you may not have a remedy. This was reaffirmed in the World Phone case, where again this issue was considered, and it was upheld that in the absence of there being reflective provisions in the Articles of Association, you could not prefer an action. Now, this is specifically crucial when you consider joint venture agreements, when you consider agreements where there are two or more than two sections of shareholders who come together. Their rights need to be embodied in the Articles of Association if they are to be enforced against the company. In the absence of these provisions finding mention in the constitutional documents, it may not be possible for those shareholders to enforce their rights, which would otherwise be available to them under contract. So let's bear this in mind. If you are claiming a right under a contract, which according to you extends to the company and to the conduct of the company, to the management of the company, you must ensure that those rights, those obligations found to the counterparty are mentioned in the Articles of Association. Similar is the case of Jindal Vijayanagar Steel Limited, where we considered joint venture agreements specifically. Let us consider the 1992 Supreme Court judgment in V.B. Rangaraj versus V.B. Gopalakrishnan, AR 1992 SC 45. In this case, an agreement was entered into between members of a family who are the only shareholders of a private company, which imposed a restriction on the shareholders' right to transfer the shares, contrary to the Articles of Association. So this is a case as we just spoke of. We're talking about an agreement between two parties. The agreement was not embodied in the Articles of Association. To the contrary, there was a contradistinct provision in the Articles of Association. The court held that it was not that such an obligation that was found in favor of one party by virtue of a contract was not binding on the company or its shareholders. Therefore, unless the articles are amended, the terms of an agreement cannot be held to be enforceable. It held that a restriction which is not specified in the Articles of Association is not binding either on the company or on the shareholders. Further, the Supreme Court accepted the proposition of the parties that an agreement between two shareholders of a company by which restrictions are imposed on their ability to transfer the shares is wholly ineffective unless it is incorporated in the articles of the company. There is a broad concurrence that when you're talking about allegations of oppression or mismanagement, you must be speaking of continuing acts, especially for oppression. Not as much for mismanagement, but especially for oppression. You must be able to make out a series of events, series of wrongs that are done, which all the way to the filing of the petition have not been corrected, have not been remedied by the board of directors of the company itself. It is only on the showing of this continuing series of misdemeanors will you be able to make out a case for oppression and mismanagement. Moving forth, let's consider the case of Dale and Carrington versus P.K. Pratap. It's a 2005 decision of the Supreme Court. The managing director of the company issued and allotted additional share capital to himself without following either any proper legal procedure or justification. This resulted in the majority shareholders of the company being reduced to a minority. The Supreme Court of India held that such conduct amounted to oppression and set aside the allotment of additional shares in favor of the managing director. However, if the power to issue shares has been exercised to create sufficient number of shareholders to enable the company to exercise statutory powers or to enable it to comply with legal requirements or in the larger interests of the company, it will not amount to oppression, even if it incidentally leads to the majority shareholders losing control of the company. So this finds echoes in needle industries as well. What this entire discussion leads us to understand is that every case is to be considered on its own merits. In the absence of this, you will really not find yourself in a position where you will be able to identify very strictly these as being the ingredients of a successful oppression or mismanagement claim. We now come to two very important decisions which have been very popular in understanding the scope of Section 241, Section 397, and oppression and mismanagement generally. One, of course, is the case of Vikram Bakshi versus Connaught Plaza Restaurants Limited and others. That's a 2017 decision. This was a case where there was a shareholder who held 50% in a company. Vikram Bakshi and Bakshi Holdings held 50%. The other 50% was held by the McDonald's Incorporated Group. It's the international company, MNC. What happened in this case was that there was an attempt by McDonald's Incorporated to take over the management of CPRPL. CPRPL was the common company in which McDonald's India Private Limited and Bakshi Holdings had 50% equal share. RPL for the longest time was controlled by Bakshi. Differences arose between Bakshi and the international and McDonald's Incorporated, and on the basis of which attempts were made to try and change the management. Now, the NCLT held that acts by the nominee directors of MIPL, that's McDonald's India, to block the reappointment of Mr. Bakshi as MD was an act of oppression. Just imagine, this is an act of oppression against 50%, and was done with the malified and premeditated intention of availing the benefits of the right to purchase his shares upon his termination. The NCLT also relied on the fact that the actions of MIPL was detrimental to public interest, as several employees of the franchise suffered due to the employment hanging in the balance owing to the decision to terminate the franchise agreement. So of the three ingredients, if you remember, public interest, interest of the company, and interest of the members, court invoked two of them. Interest, public interest and interest of a member or a certain segment of members. The NCLT held that this is a continuing trend of the respondent's prejudice and oppression towards Mr. Bakshi. Therefore, it held that this is a case of oppression and mismanagement. The NCLT reinstated Bakshi as the managing director. The main issue was whether the NCLT had jurisdiction in this matter. The question arose as the matter was regarding a dispute in the joint venture agreement, which is argued to be a private contract with the respondents. As the provisions of the agreement were incorporated within the Articles of Association of CPRPL, NCLT expanded its jurisdiction to conclude that such contracts that are incorporated in the AOA will fall within the jurisdiction of NCLT. The NCLT also reaffirmed the position that it could pass any judgment on any matter if it dealt with the protection of any member or class of members from oppression or mismanagement. Another takeaway from this case is the non-enforcement of arbitration of the arbitration clause that was contained in the agreement. We'll deal with that in a separate section subsequently, where we talk about the arbitrability of oppression and mismanagement claims. But in this case, there was a simultaneous petition filed before the Delhi High Court under the Arbitration Act, and the Delhi High Court did not allow for the enforcement of the arbitration clause, saying that the matter was being dealt with by the NCLT. In a sense, the same subject matter, the same parties. This judgment has, of course, elucidated what qualifies as oppression and must be dealt with on the facts of the case, and a clear bona fide intent must be established through such facts. That's crucial. You need to establish that the parties who are acting on behalf of the company, who are steering the company, are acting in a bona fide manner. We now come to what is probably the most discussed case under oppression and mismanagement, which is, of course, the case of Cyrus Investments, Cyrus Mistry Tata dispute, which started as a boardroom takeover and spilled over into the NCLT, subsequently to the NCLAT, and is now pending before the Supreme Court. Pursuant to the decision of the board of directors of Tata Sons on 24th of October 2016, Cyrus Valentin Mistry was removed as the executive chairman of the company. The removal appeared to be a culmination of various correspondence that was exchanged between Mistry and other members, including Ratan Tata, for the performances of various Tata Group companies. Because of the sudden removal of Mistry from the post of executive chairman, the appellants, Cyrus Investments Private Limited and Sterling Investment Corporation Limited, who were the shareholders, minority group of shareholders, largely called the SP Group or the Shahpurji Palanji Group, moved an application under 241-242 of the Companies Act of 13, alleging prejudicial and oppressional acts of the majority shareholders, which is the Tata Group. According to Mistry's petition, Tata Sons abused the Articles of Association and the governance framework in order to enable Ratan Tata to retain control of the company. The Mumbai bench of the NCLT, presided over by members BSV Prakash and Nala Senapati, dismissed the petition filed by the Mistry's investment firms on merits. No merits were found on issues raised pertaining to minority shareholding under section 241-242. They said, and I quote, "We have not found any purported merit or issues raised by the YMP shareholder in the petition under 241-242. It also found no merit in Mistry's arguments that Ratan Tata and Tata Sons trustees interfered in the governance of Tata Sons, which, as we all know, is the holding company. The NCLAT, however, reversed the order and held that given the affirmative voting power of the nominated directors of the Tata Trust over the majority decision of the board, actions taken by Mr. Tata, Mr. Nitin Boria, Mr. N.A. Sonawala, and others, the fact that the company, Tata Sons, had suffered losses because of prejudicial decisions taken by the board of directors, including but not limited to a number of Tata companies, change in the status of Tata Sons from a public company to a private company, the manner in which Cyrus Mistry was suddenly and hastily removed without any reason and in absence of any discussion in the meeting shown in the board of directors, held and his subsequent removal as the director, and the global effect of such removal as accepted by the company in its press statement. Of course, in these boardroom battles become common knowledge. There is a large impact on how the company trades on various stock exchanges as a consequence of this. Now, all these actions form a consecutive chain of events with a cumulative effect, justifying a case of prejudicial and oppressive action by the contesting respondents. In the instant case, all major decisions were taken in advance by the Tata Trust, and for taking every decision, matters were placed before them. The independence of the board of directors came into question. From the various record of communication, chain of events, the tribunal held that there is a clear case of prejudicial and oppressive action by the contesting respondents. In these circumstances, it was held that the court was convinced that a case for winding up the company was essential, but of course that the winding up would be unfair to its members, and that it was just and equitable in the present circumstances for the court to pass an order, pass necessary directions under 242. Cyrus Mistry was of course reinstated. That prayer was sought to be suspended for a period of 4 weeks, so that the Tata Group could approach the Supreme Court, which they did. The order of the NCLAT has been stayed, and a final order is awaited. This is a seminal ruling on what we understand today as the law of oppression and mismanagement, because it is considered in great detail. And I have no doubt that the Supreme Court is likely to do the same in terms of revisiting and reinforcing what the law of oppression and mismanagement is. We now come to the last segment, which is the arbitrability of oppression and mismanagement claims in India. Now, fundamentally, the jurisprudence in such cases speaks of the incapability of parties from contracting out of statutory rights, contracting out of right and rent. Therefore, if you have a right that is protected by a statute, if it's a right that is not in personam, it's not individual, but a right that you claim on behalf of a larger section of people, you would not be able to contract that out. You would not be able to make out a case that if I were to exclude that right specifically by contract, or if I were to suggest in a private contract that claims of this nature ought to be arbitrated as against being brought before the National Company Law Tribunal under 241, 242. The courts have consistently held that this right is unlikely to be enforced. As we saw in the McDonald's case as well, that we were essentially talking about a situation where there was an arbitration contract, but given the rights available to Bakshi under 241, 242, the Delhi High Court held that this really cannot be a case where we can uphold private rights between the parties in circumstances where there is a case of prejudicing of interests of members
आकाश जी, आकाश जी,
Yeah, we are just connected. 1 minute, just 1 minute. The speaker is just connecting back.
I'm sorry about that. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So we were talking, of course, about the arbitrability of matters of oppression and mismanagement. Now, back in 1999, after the 96 Act came into force, in the case of Haryana Telecom versus Sterlite Industries, EIR 1999 SC 2354, the arbitrability of claims of oppression and mismanagement, of winding up petition was considered, and what held that you could not arbitrate matters relating to winding up a company, which is specifically provided for under 433, 434. To understand this further, let's also delve for a moment into the Booz Allen case, Booz Allen Hamilton versus SBI Home Finance, 2011 5 SEC, where the Supreme Court defined what would be arbitrable. It said that arbitrable disputes are one arising from the arbitration agreement, two, those that parties have referred to arbitration, three, which are capable of being adjudicated through arbitration. Now, as per the precedent laid down in Booz Allen, such claims ought to be considered arbitrable. While such claims arise from a right in personam, they are also productive activities that are conducted in a manner that is prejudicial to public interest. It may therefore be pertinent to consider the views that rights emanating from public interest cannot be waived by contractual provisions. This may render such claims as inarbitrable. In multiple cases, the court has observed that the right to file a petition concerning oppression claims arises out of the commercial relationship between the shareholders. And while the principles applicable to winding up do not necessarily apply to oppression, it may be significant to note the provisions of the Arbitration Act are not repugnant to the provisions of Section 9. Section 9 is basically a section in the Companies Act. It says that you would have overriding applicability of provisions of the Companies Act, especially when it comes to the MOA and AOA. Now, a deviation from this position was noticed when the courts laid down certain tests to make arbitration applicable on such cases of oppression and mismanagement. Now, the test laid down in Gautam Kapoor versus Limrose Engineering, 2005, 128 company cases, 237 CLB, was to consider whether the allegations of oppression or mismanagement could be adjudicated without reference to the terms of the arbitration agreement. And if the answer to this is yes, then the question of reference to the arbitration does not arise. In Sudarshan Chopra versus CLB, the CLB also established that the statutory jurisdiction of parties cannot be ousted even with the consent of the parties. You cannot contract out of a statutory provision. Similar decision in the Sporting Pastime India case versus Sporting Pastime India versus Kasturi and Sons case. It's a 2007 1 arbitration law reports 99 Madras, which held that the CLB is empowered to deal with oppression claims independently. It clarified that it cannot be said that the issues involved in the arbitration and the issues coming under 397 are two different issues. And the scope of the petition filed under 397 would be distinct from the scope of the arbitration clause contained in the agreement. This reasoning was further solidified in Rakesh Malhotra versus Rajendra Malhotra. The jurisprudence essentially evolved to suggest that if we are talking about a situation where the facts of the case are such that the parties, the nature of the claim, the extent of the claim, and the reliefs that are sought are capable of being resolved by a statutory court, then a recourse to an arbitration or an arbitral tribunal may not be necessary. Now, it may be correct to say that the courts and judicial authorities in India have a view that oppression and mismanagement and unfair prejudice claims are usually not capable of settlement by arbitration because claims relating to oppression and mismanagement stand on a different footing as the NCLT has been vested with a special statutory power. An arbitral tribunal, being a creature of a contract, can only adjudicate disputes in accordance with the terms of the contract. A view that was upheld in Punita Khattar versus Explorer Travels and Tours Private Limited, 2017 136 CLA 34. where the NCLT took a view that the jurisdiction of the NCLT and the NCLAT cannot be ousted even with the consent of the parties. Therefore, any agreement that seeks to oust the jurisdiction of the NCLAT or the NCLT is void to that extent. Another point of law that has been considered is the bifurcation of claims. That you cannot the Arbitration Act does not allow for bifurcation of claims. You cannot have one set of claims being agitated before a certain forum and a separate set of claims with relation to the same subject matter, the same parties being agitated before a second court, a second tribunal, a second forum. While examining whether the petitioner is being dressed up or vexatious, courts and judicial authorities have opined that one needs to read the petition as a whole, with specific emphasis on the grounds and the reliefs claimed in the petition. If on such holistic analysis, the NCLT or the NCLAT comes to the conclusion that the reliefs in the petition could be granted by an arbitral tribunal, and the petition was primarily intended to defeat the arbitration agreement. This is where we go to the other end of the spectrum and understand cases where you specifically try to make out a case where you allege malafide, you allege action which is of such a vexing nature that can be remedied only by a 241, 242 court and not by an arbitral tribunal. So the court is trying to guard against those kind of vexatious actions. And therefore it said that in the event that oppression, mismanagement or prejudice petitions are found to be dressed up, frivolous, vexatious and lacks commonality between the parties, it will not act as an impediment to the matters being referred to arbitration. Thus, from the aforesaid analysis, it is clear that disputes relating to oppression, mismanagement and unfair prejudice are considered to be inarbitrable in India in a broad sense. You would of course have to consider this from a case-to-case perspective. The Arbitration Act, as I said again, does not permit bifurcation of the dispute or mandate reference of the parties to arbitration when there is no commonality of parties. In conclusion, therefore, what we are speaking of is a situation where the law of oppression and mismanagement has evolved to a great extent. There is a lot of statutory reinforcement in terms of what the guiding lights, the guiding principles of the oppression and mismanagement law are. We've understood the arbitrability of oppression and mismanagement claims and how in most cases they would not be permitted in the absence of you being able to make out a case of a frivolous or a vexatious action. Many cases in today's age of business often don't reach court. Like we said, like we were speaking of the Indigo case, for example, where there were serious allegations of misconduct against one of the promoters of the company. We again spoke of a very interesting case, again, which never really reached courts, was the case of the British American tobacco company and the shareholding it had in ITC, where there was a boardroom battle unfolded essentially because the Indian management of ITC did not want British American Tobacco, which at that time had 31% shareholding in the company, to gain majority shareholding, 51%, on the singular ground that the Indianness of the company would be lost. The company, with a 51% majority shareholding, would not remain an Indian company. If these cases were to have come to court and been challenged under 397, 398 or 241, 242, it is anyone's guess as to whether a case could have been made out for oppression of minority, for actions being against prejudicial interests of the company. It is therefore incumbent upon the tribunals to, on a case-to-case basis, analyze whether whether merit is found in the claim of the petitioner for interference in the management of the company, in the conduct of the company. At the very least, courts must approach this with an open mind and with the intent of trying to safeguard what is established as the substratum of the company and what is in the larger interest of the public associated with the company, the larger interests of the company at large, and while balancing those rights vis-a-vis the rights of the minority shareholders. The minority, though they may not have a voice, deserve to be heard. And it is that protection that Section 241 under the earlier Act 397, 398 have consistently tried to protect. The need for a muted voice, but a voice nevertheless to be heard by the majority view, to be heard within the four corners, within the four walls of the boardroom. And it is that right that the tribunals are expected to protect. There are, of course, multitudes of cases that you would find where courts have held different yardsticks to understand what oppression is. That discretion is a curse, and in many cases, it is a blessing. It's unfortunately the best system that we have, and I believe in many senses it is the only system that could balance the democratic rights of a corporation, the rights of a company to decide its own fate within the boardroom, within the annual general meetings, before the general body, and compare that with the rights of the minority, protecting the rights of the minority. With this, I conclude. I'm thankful once again to Mr. Vyas for allowing me this opportunity to come before you and discuss what is a vast subject, but a very interesting subject nevertheless. I would be remiss if I do not at this point thank my junior associates, Ben C. Ramakrishnan and Priyanka Raja, whose dedication and eagle research in this matter have been, would have left me, in the absence of which I would have been ill-equipped to be giving this presentation. So thank you. And thank you to all of you for sitting through this slightly protracted discussion on oppression and mismanagement under the Companies Act. Thank you, Mr. Vyas.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Akashi,
Yes, Sharaji.
some problem?
I'm sorry?
Some problem?
No, I think I was just waiting for Mr. Vyas. I believe,
By chance he left.
yeah, concluded.
So we can conclude it?
Yeah, thank you so much.